Hello, everybody. It is Thursday in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. My name is Adam Bittner, assistant sports editor for multimedia at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, joined for our weekly Penn State football podcast by Joel Haas of the Daily Collegian and the Post-Gazette. We're going to get into Penn State's offseason, which has already begun in earnest. Tom Allen leaving as defensive coordinator for Clemson. Trey Wallace, Omari Evans, top receiving options entering the transfer portal. How much will Penn State miss them? And of course, we've had a bunch of names both decide to go to the NFL. Abdul Carter, top of that list, but Penn State's also had success at keeping some of these guys from going to the pros. Drew Allar, Nick Singleton, Kaytron Allen, Dani, Dennis-Sutton. So we're going to break it all down. Lots of moves to get into. We'll maybe even talk about the Orange Bowl a little bit later on, but I think we're going to mostly be spinning this episode forward. So first of all, Joel, how are you? How was Miami?
Miami was awesome. Didn't get to spend as much time there as I maybe would have wanted because the winter weather kind of messed up the flight plans and things like that. I ended up with a 6-hour layover in Orlando before I got to Miami on what was originally supposed to be a 3-hour direct flight there. So that was great, but Miami was awesome. Much better weather than what we have here in State College, and Hard Rock was probably my favorite stadium that I've ever been to. So.
Yeah, it looks like a neat place. They got the F1 track wrapped around it. So regret that I missed this trip, but maybe we'll see Penn State there in the future. Joel, I'm going to start the podcast this way. With all those losses that I named off the top, what's the biggest in your mind in terms of Penn State's hopes in 2025? Is it Tom Allen as the defensive coordinator? Did you like the work he did? Do you think Penn State will miss what he brought to the table? Do you think they'll miss their receivers? I believe it's a pretty high percentage of their what was set to be their returning receiving yardage just walked out the door when Trey Wallace and Omari Evans decided to enter the portal? Or is it guys like Abdul, Carter, Tyler Warren, Jalen Kimber? Is that changing the nature of this team the most heading into next season?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of, just strictly talent, obviously Abdul, Carter, and Tyler Warren are kind of, unrivaled. In that regard, they were Penn State's best offensive and defensive players this year. So just in terms of, the biggest pieces that are departing from the program, I think you obviously have to start with those guys. In terms of Tom Allen, I assume we'll probably get a little bit more into that later. I don't necessarily view that as a huge loss for Penn State, just because I'm not expecting much of a drop off. Given kind of James Franklin's track record with who he hires. If we're factoring in kind of positional value, I think Kobe King is a really big loss for Penn State. He declared for the NFL draft, so he'll attempt to join his brother Kalen in the pros a year later. But I think that's actually a pretty big loss for Penn State just because of what they have in that linebacker room. That's a room that was really thin this year, and it kind of benefited because Tom Allen played a base 4-2-5 defense, right? So they had one fewer linebacker on the field for a lot of plays than what they would have had in years prior with Manny Diaz and Brent Pry. And now you're losing one of those linebackers. If the next defensive coordinator that you hire wants to go back to a 3 linebacker set, you're in even more trouble because now you have to find some other guys to step in who aren't going to have starting experience. I mean, you've got Tony Rojas returning, and I've seen some mixed opinions about, kind of how he played this season. And I think it's fair to say he had a pretty up and down season where he showed flashes and, he had the pick 6 against SMU, which was an incredible play. But there were times this year where I think he was, hitting the wrong gaps and missing tackles and just not playing sound disciplined football this season. And if that's kind of your leading linebacker in the room right now, you might be in trouble, projecting forward to next year because you look at, what else you have in that room. It's, Dom DeLuca just recently announced he's coming back, and obviously he's played a ton for Penn State, but I don't think anyone views him as, an all Big Ten caliber type of guy. I think linebacker was already, you could say, an area of weakness this season. And then, with the departure of Kobe King, I think it gets even worse because I'm not sure, who the next guys are to step in and replace them. So I would say that departure, and that was one that I think probably was very close. I think that was probably a decision that he spent a lot of time on that could have gone either way. And ultimately, he decides to pursue his dream of going to the NFL, which obviously you can't blame him for that. But at the same time, if you're Penn State, that's a position that you could be in trouble at next year. And this is a school that prides itself as being LBU. So you never want to see, your depth being kind of in the situation that it is right now.
Let's get into the Tom Allen move a little bit more, Joel. What do you think went on there? Was there a level on which you looked at? I mean, statistically, this defense was not as good as last season's under Manny Diaz. I think you look at that statistically. I think you can say situationally, they didn't get off the field in some occasions where it might have most helped them. They struggled situationally. They struggled in that Big Ten title game against Oregon is, I think, probably the most notable example, but you get burned several times in the Ohio State loss. And you just can't get the stop you need late against Notre Dame to keep your season going. Do you think there was any level of mutual parting there between James Franklin and Tom Allen, or is it just a matter of maybe Dabo and Clemson were offering more money and that's all that really mattered in the end?
Yeah, I think it's most likely a combination of a few factors. I think if you're Penn State, you're not freaking out about this and kind of crashing out at the loss of Tom Allen. I think you're pretty confident in, regardless of who the next guy is. It seems like they might already be circling in on a decision. I see they have like some meetings scheduled and things like that to potentially finalize something. But I think if you're Penn State, it's not necessarily a huge loss just because of what you can get. When you look at kind of the history of just defense at Penn State, obviously Penn State historically has been a kind of defensive minded team. And you look at the last three defensive coordinators who are here, whether it was Brent Pry, Manny Diaz, and Tom Allen, they've all had extremely high levels of success with top 10 defenses consistently. And at a certain point, I think it goes beyond who the defensive coordinator is. At a program like Penn State that's so established, that recruits so well on the defensive side of the ball and has such a strong track record, I think more so it's the program that is at such a stable place right now that it can consistently produce these top 10 defenses. And if you look at this past year, what Penn State was able to do, obviously you have to give Tom Allen credit because he had a top 10 defense statistically, but at the same time, you can look at the talent that was on that defense and you can reasonably say that it was, a lot of it had to do with those guys kind of doing their job and the players kind of making plays when it mattered. So from that regard, I think Penn State is most likely going to be fine moving forward. And I think, I don't know, how hard they necessarily fought to keep Tom Allen here. I thought it was pretty interesting, some of the discourse on Twitter about, which program is better. Is this kind of a lateral move? Is it a downgrade? Is it an upgrade? Whatever. And I think there's some valid arguments on both sides of that. I think one of the biggest things that Tom Allen cited, both when he left, they put out the graphic, and then he had a presser, I believe earlier today when he got to Clemson, and he once again referenced that he wanted to be closer to his daughters. He talked about having two daughters nearby to Clemson, and that they've had to make a lot of sacrifices with, him being a former head coach for however many 8 years at Indiana. Obviously, that's an extremely time-consuming role. He probably had to miss, birthdays, Christmas, whatever it was, with his daughters, things like that, just because of how busy he was with that role. And then obviously, constantly moving around the country and not always being home. So I think for him, a lot of it was just wanting to be close to family. He's also, getting up there in age. I think he wants to kind of enjoy that time with his daughters and things like that. I think that really did play a big role in it. And then we've also seen some information that he's getting $1.9 million a year from Clemson, which I think is about 0.5 million more than what he had at Penn State, if I'm not mistaken. So obviously there's a financial upgrade as well. But I tend to believe the biggest thing there is that, he really just wanted to be closer to his family. That's something that he's continued to kind of harp on. And I don't think Penn State necessarily fought too hard to keep him.
Joel, where would you like to see Penn State go with this role moving forward? I think there are in-house candidates. Anthony Poindexter was someone we were talking about a year ago when you were replacing Manny Diaz. He has another year kind of a seasoning. I believe he was co-defensive coordinator. Dan Connor's a guy with a lot of history at Penn State, a ton of tackles in uniform, has kind of found a niche popular with some of the players. Those are the in-house guys. Then there's been some chatter, of course, from folks about Al Golden. If Marcus Freeman makes a move to the NFL, do you bring a legacy guy like Al Golden home, especially seeing what he did against you in the Orange Bowl a week ago? Or do you look at an outside candidate? I'll just give my thoughts first. I think you stick with the guys you've got in the room. I think you've got to show to continue to get talent coming into these positions, to get guys like Dan Connor and Anthony Poindexter that have pedigree. You've got to show them that you're willing to promote within as well. And that's not to say that, when a Manny Diaz is available or a Tom Allen's available, that going out and getting them is necessarily a bad thing, but I think we've reached a point where you've cultivated this bench behind those guys for a few years. Now it's kind of time to see what that staff can do moving forward. And Penn State's had success with guys who've worked under Franklin for a period of time. Before Brent Pry, it was Bob Shoop, who had success here. So what's your read on what the right move there is and what direction you think they might ultimately go?
Yeah, it's interesting because the fans obviously have a clear favorite here. I think they're kind of all in on Poindexter, at least from what I've been seeing, and kind of keeping it in house, which I don't, I think that could potentially be the best option here. I would, obviously reach out to a bunch of guys and see kind of gauging interest. And a guy like Al Golden, obviously, like you mentioned with Notre Dame, has had a lot of success there. I think it's interesting because James Franklin hasn't typically, promoted from within. And you could say that that's on Franklin and kind of his mentality in terms of hiring. But I think also a lot of that goes back to a lot of the assistants on this staff have had opportunities elsewhere and chosen to remain in their roles, which I think, speaks to the culture that is kind of built at Penn State. But a guy like Terry Smith comes to mind where, he's gone on the record with us, with the media, and said that he's had opportunities to be a head coach somewhere else. And he's chosen to stay because he just kind of enjoys, being at Penn State and having his own kind of niche coaching the cornerbacks. There are a few other guys, and Jaywan Sider's a guy who's come up in some coaching searches. There are guys on Penn State staff who, seem content to kind of stay in that coordinator role, which, and they've obviously done a great job in that position to even earn that kind of buzz as, potential upgrades for offensive, defensive coordinator, head coach, whatever it may be. But from the fan perspective, I think they're certainly, in favor of either Poindexter or Connor. Connor, to me, my only kind of pushback there is I don't think he has a ton of experience in coaching so far. He's obviously a little bit newer to getting in the coaching side of things, and I think he's done a good job. He was actually responsible for kind of calling the plays there with. He took over for Tom Allen like midway through the season when Allen went up to the box. But I don't know. To me, I still question kind of the lack of experience at a coaching level, and would maybe give it some more time there. Poindexter, I think, would be leading in that regard. But again, looking at what Franklin's done historically, he tends to kind of go out and get guys from other programs, especially recently when you look at the last couple hires where he got former head coaches to come in from other universities. And so, he had a lot of success with Diaz and with Allen. I think, based on that, you could say that maybe he wants to go back to that well again and kind of follow the same blueprint that he's already set and look for maybe, former head coaches or even just former defensive coordinators and guys like that. So I think there are a lot of options on the table. I don't know if I necessarily have a lean at this point. I think they're going to, I think they should reach out to as many candidates as they can and, go through the interview process and see what everyone has to say. But if Poindexter wants the job, I think that's a great option just because obviously he's been extremely successful in a pretty short time at Penn State and seems to, the guys certainly seem to like playing for him. Seems like he's a great recruiter and everything like that, which is kind of, those are all the traits you want in a defensive coordinator. So I think right now the betting favorite would probably be Poindexter, but I also wouldn't be surprised to see, a ton of other names.
Yeah, D'Anton Lynn's another name who's at USC now, who's kind of been, somewhat of a hot commodity, jumped over from UCLA last season. Obviously, Penn State fans have kind of had their eye on him, and maybe he can do, some better things here. I don't see a person out there like a Manny Diaz or a Tom Allen, though, right now, Joel. I think those guys were both home runs in that they were, like, available, kind of got, the circumstance was a problem for them where they got fired from jobs, especially Manny Diaz. It was very messy with the transition to Mario Cristobal down there. So you were kind of fortunate that those guys, to some extent, fell in your lap. I don't know if there's a situation like that, this season. And, even though James Franklin's focused more on those types of guys, it wouldn't be completely out of character for him to go with one of his own, I think, especially on the defensive side. Let's switch gears, though, Joel. Let's talk about the receivers. I think the big headline of the week, Trey Wallace, Omari Evans, on the portal front at least, enter the portal, leave Penn State. They were Penn State's top two receivers. Had their moments. I think of Trey Wallace in the season opening game against West Virginia. The Peach Bowl before that had a pretty solid game. Omari Evans had some great deep ball touchdowns, including in the Fiesta Bowl against Boise State, but ultimately neither one catches a pass in the Orange Bowl. Both struggled heavily against Ohio State and Michigan, like many of these Penn State receivers in recent years. So how do you view the loss of those guys? Because I think I've kind of seen two narratives take hold of like, this is a disaster and this team's in a lot of trouble. But I think I've also seen a lot of people say kind of, and this is probably the camp that I'm in, you can lose with those guys. You can lose without, you're going to lose without them. It's not a big deal to lose guys who are going to come up as small as they did in big games.
Yeah, I think it's just funny that a lot of the same people that were kind of harsh on Penn State's wide receivers throughout the season, probably deservedly so. But a lot of the same people that were complaining about kind of the wide receiver production this year are also the ones complaining about James Franklin and Marcus Hagans now that those receivers are gone. And to me, obviously, you never want to lose those guys, and I think it was a little bit unexpected, at least in my mind, because those were the top receivers and they were getting production when you had guys like Mekhi Flowers and Tyler Johnson who were transferring out. That was understandable given kind of where they are right now in their progression, in terms of eligibility, kind of running out of time there and not getting touches at Penn State. Obviously, that makes a little bit more sense. Harrison Wallace, I would say was a bit surprising to me, just because he was wide receiver 1 this year. He was probably had the same role locked up next year, kind of barring what happens with the transfers. But I think in a sense you could just say that the room just needed a reset. And this isn't necessarily something new, because you look at last year, Penn State lost its top 2 receivers as well, in Dante Cephas, Keandre Lambert-Smith, both transferred out after last season, and this year they lose their next 2 top receivers. So it's just been, a revolving door there. You look at kind of returning production. Obviously, Tyler Warren had a big chunk of that, and he's gone as well. So I believe the leading returning receiver is Liam Clifford at this point, which if you're a Penn State fan, you're probably not too enthusiastic about that. But obviously, Penn State's done some work in the transfer portal. Got a couple guys who are coming in. Kyron Hudson from USC, who has kind of a limited sample size, given what he did there, but had some, he had that one highlight reel play. They've got Devonte Ross coming in from Troy as well, who was 1,000-yard receiver last season. But obviously, the question remains whether that production will kind of translate to the Big Ten level. I know he did have like 3 touchdowns and 200 yards against Iowa this season. So you would think he could produce against a Big Ten level. So if you're Penn State, I think at the end of the day, your transfers in and out probably kind of cancel out. But just in terms of team culture, you're hoping that maybe it's kind of a restart for everyone. And, you're obviously, hoping that wherever those guys go, wherever Harrison Wallace and Omari Evans end up, if you're Penn State, you still want them to be successful at their next stop. But it just seemed like it wasn't going to work out at Penn State. And I mean, to me, obviously, you don't want to lose your top 2 receivers when they still had eligibility remaining. But at the same time, it's this room can't get much worse than it has been the last couple of years. So why not cycle in a few new guys and see what sticks, I guess.
What's your read on Ross and Hudson that you mentioned there? Are they guys that you can count on for similar production? Can they be better players, or is Penn State still going to need another hit or 2 in this transfer portal for you to believe that they're going to make progress at this position with Drew Allar coming back in 25?
Yeah, I mean, if it were me, I think Penn State, should go and throw a bag at a wide receiver. It's going to be expensive. You're probably going to have to overpay just because, there's a premium on that position. And you're going to have to outbid a lot of other schools with a lot more NIL money. But I think if you're Penn State, you have to make that a priority. Obviously, they've already got a couple guys coming in like we talked about. But I don't know if either of those guys, you could say are kind of bona fide, wide receiver 1 type guys. They've both kind of shown promise, and you can point to specific things as for maybe reasons for optimism for both of them, but it's hard to say definitively that either of them will be able to step in as kind of a wide receiver 1. And so I think you need to go out and look at some of those top end wide receivers in the market right now. I mean, realistically, I'm not sure how many there even are at this point. And I don't know if Penn State will do that, because I think what we've seen so far, and with Nick Singleton coming back, Kaytron Allen coming back, Zane Durant coming back, Zachy Wheatley coming back, all these guys are returning to Penn State. I think part of it is that Penn State has chosen to use its NIL on player retention as opposed to going out in the market and looking for new players. That's, you can argue whether or not that's the correct strategy to take here, but I think that's what Penn State has chosen to go with. They've always been a program that's been, heavily focused on development. I think they're sticking with that, and they're choosing to use NIL to bring in, here's a guy that's been here for 3, 4, 5 years, whatever, and we know what we have in him. He's been with the program for years and is familiar with the coaching staff and the scheme and everything like that. And Penn State is choosing to retain those guys for an extra year, and kind of fighting off the NFL there, as opposed to going out in the portal and bringing in kind of unknown guys, question marks, which, again, you can argue whether or not that's the right strategy, but I think that's what Penn State has done to this point, and I think that's what they'll continue to do.
Yeah, I want to talk about Penn State's portal strategy in a little bit, because obviously with all those big names returning, that's huge news for 2025, and certainly warrants discussion. It's just a matter of, you got this. It's a glaring weakness, Joel. I don't know that I remember Penn State having such a glaring need at any one position as they do right now. And so that's, got to be part of the conversation. If you're going to spend any money on the outside, you've got to spend it there. And maybe linebacker, like we were talking about earlier. Last question on this topic, Joel. Marcus Hagans has presided over this mess. Do you sense that he is on the hot seat, or that he should be on the hot seat, and that maybe you hire an assistant coach with some different connections that can bring some different guys in, if you hire him?
Yeah, it's been simply bad, and it's kind of unfortunate that college football and sports in general work that way, where you're speculating about somebody's job status. Like we don't have anyone talk about us, like, oh, they had a bad podcast last week, I wonder if they're going to get let go. Like, it's a little bit different, so I hate to kind of
you'd be surprised, Joel.
I mean, maybe in like the YouTube comments, but realistically, just it kind of sucks that's the situation that we're in. But I think realistically speaking, it's a performance-based profession. You have to get results on the field, or you'll get let go. And I think Franklin has been pretty quick to pull the trigger in the past. I look at some of the offensive coordinators and the switches that Penn State's made there. And I think he's been willing to kind of make a change when it's necessary. I think I was a little bit surprised, honestly, that Hagans didn't get let go at the end of the season, just given kind of what we've seen. It's obviously been a small sample size, and I think the one thing that you can kind of say that's kind of keeping Hagans there is the recruiting, because you can say that none of these guys that have kind of been underperforming on the field have really been his guys that he recruited, brought in, developed. And you've got a couple of 4-star guys who came in, whether it was the freshmen this year or the incoming class, and you can say give Hagans a chance with his guys, the guys that he personally chose to recruit, go after, and bring in, and what can he do with those guys. So I think if you're Penn State, I mean, you can be in wait and see mode, but I think I think there's a reasonable expectation that Hagans should be able to develop the existing guys in the room. Whether he recruited them or not, they're wide receivers. A lot of them were, 3 or 4-star guys. So they're certainly underperforming what they were supposed to do based on recruiting. And even in that regard, Penn State just missed out on a target, Elias Koch, who was only a 3-star recruit. So not, super highly thought of. That's a guy that you probably don't have a lot of, it's not like you're competing against Georgia, Ohio State, schools like that to bring him in. And he's a Pennsylvania guy. And you lost him to Rutgers, right? So you just kind of never want to see that happen. So it seems like Penn State, whether it's, bleeding guys to the transfer portal or missing out on some of these kind of layup, recruiting battles and he was a guy who had a crystal ball from 247 Sports. He was expected to land at Penn State. And just recently, I think it was this morning, decided to go to Rutgers. So it's a really bad look on all fronts for Marcus Hagans right now. And I think, obviously you need something massive next year, just for kind of that job security.
I don't know if it needs to be massive, Joel. I think it's just got to be like average. Can you get an average Big Ten receiving core in here? If you do, I think you have the pieces around them that you can still compete to be at this spot next year. But you're not going to beat any of these teams that we talk about them beating when your receivers are catching 0 balls or getting no targets in the first half of a game and racking up yardage at garbage time like Trey Wallace did last season. You're just not going to win at this level without that. So, for me, it's not a matter of can you get in like a Jahan Dotson or a KJ Hamler, an Allen Robinson, like those types of guys. you're not going to get them overnight, and I don't think that has to be the bar, but you got to get guys. You brought up Mitchell Tinsley on this podcast a couple of weeks ago. I think that's the baseline here of like a solid guy who can produce and that you can rely on in a big game, but not necessarily a game-breaking talent. But that's got to be the bar. And if Marcus Hagans can't get you to that point by this time next year, then you've got to start looking in a different direction now, in my opinion. Joel, let's pivot to the guys they lost to the NFL and the guys they kept from going to the NFL. We'll start with the losses. Abdul Carter, Tyler Warren are the biggest names. You've got some kind of that next layer down, guys like Jalen Kimber. I believe they had a defensive lineman move on. Those types of guys, when you look at the situation as a whole, you mentioned Kobe King at the top of the show. When you look at their situation as a whole in terms of the guys who went to the NFL, do you think they have the depth behind them to be in the same spot next season, a Final Four caliber team with, a Dennis-Sutton stepping into maybe the role of an Abdul Carter, or, Luke Reynolds, Khalil Dinkins, those tight ends stepping in where Tyler Warren was? Do you believe in Penn State's ability with the guys it still has on its roster to reload rather than have to rebuild?
Yeah, I think so. Obviously, if you're Penn State, you're losing some really key pieces, but it's also not nearly as bad as it could have been. There are, several guys who could have left and chose to stay that we touched on a little bit. And you're not going to get, there is no Abdul Carter 2.0, but Dennis-Sutton, we saw what he was able to do in that playoff run. He had 4.5 sacks in 3 games throughout that playoff run, and obviously had some other flashes throughout the regular season as well. He was dealing with injury at times that he was battling. There were games where he was playing at 70-80%, according to James Franklin. And so, I think he's a guy who could step up and be kind of that next monster edge rusher for Penn State. In terms of tight end, I'm really high on what Luke Reynolds can be, and I have to be careful with how I phrase this, but I think Luke Reynolds could end up being a better tight end than Tyler Warren. And I don't necessarily mean from a production standpoint, because it's almost impossible for him to go out and put up 1,300 yards or whatever Tyler Warren did this season. But just in terms of his raw athleticism, I mean, Luke Reynolds was a former, I believe he was a 5-star by at least some recruiting outlets. And he's in terms of, and I think 247 had him as the number 1 tight end in the class. Obviously he was a freshman this season. And, when you're behind a guy like Tyler Warren, who wins the Mackey Award for best tight end in the country, it's going to be a little bit hard to find some playing time. Penn State mostly used him just kind of in a blocking role when they rolled out 2 tight ends. Sometimes it was him, sometimes it was Khalil Dinkins who was in there. I think Reynolds will be tight end 1 next year over Khalil Dinkins, and I'm really high on what he can do physically. I mean, we saw flashes this year. We saw him get the 1 touchdown, which was a nice play, or you think about the trick play punt against Minnesota where he takes it 33 yards down the field. You definitely saw flashes of the talent there. And I think, part of that is just a trust in the coaches as well. You look at what Ty Howell's been able to do and his track record recently of all the guys Penn State's sending to the NFL. And then you look at what Deion Barnes has done on the defensive line. And, you lost Chop Robinson and Adisa Isaac off of last year's team, and you reloaded with Abdul Carter and Dennis-Sutton this year. And then you project forward and you're still in a great spot where you have a ton of guys coming back at defensive end. And I think, part of it is Penn State has recruited well enough that they can avoid a steep fall off. And part of it is just kind of trusting those coordinators who have done such a good job of reloading, that I think Penn State will be good at those positions. And I think this is a year where you're probably looking at 4 to 5 guys getting drafted out of Penn State, which compared to the last few years, I think it was in the 7 or 8 range. It's going to be a little bit lower this year, and it's not because Penn State had less talent. It's just because more guys decided to come back this year than the last couple of years, which I think is going to be really big for Penn State. And obviously, again, you're losing some really, really talented players. Abdul Carter might be a top 5 pick. We've even heard a little bit of buzz about him going number 1, number 2, something like that. Tyler Warren, obviously, first rounder. But just kind of, again, like I said, the way that Penn State's recruited, the way they've developed, I don't think there will be a huge fall off at those positions. And then you look at a lot of the other positions where guys are coming back, and those positions should be even better next year. So I think if you're Penn State, the expectation is that you can probably once again reach the semifinals.
You mentioned those guys coming back, Joel, and I remember having my hair on fire when Micah Shrewsbury left the basketball program a couple of years ago, saying, "Look, I mean, if you lose Micah Shrewsbury, how are you going to have the money to keep Drew Allar? How are you going to have the money to keep Dick Singleton, Kaytron Allen, these types of guys from going on to other programs, let alone go to the NFL?" Here we are, almost 2 years later, and all three of those guys are going to be 4-year seniors at Penn State. They're going to have some chances to break some all-time records. I look at this and where they were 2 years ago for the entire athletic department, not just football, where they were 2 years ago and where they are now. This has to be the biggest win of the NIL era to date for Penn State, and I think it is emblematic of a phenomenon that I was listening to an Ohio State podcast. Big Ryan. He's unpopular. I think he was one of the lunatic fringe people that Kirk Herbstreit was referring to on that Ohio State Tennessee broadcast. But he made the point after the Tennessee game that, listen, this is the possibility of a real shift here in the balance of power, because northern schools like Penn State, Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame, that have these not just big alumni bases, but rich alumni bases, CEOs. I think Penn State has the most CEOs of any school, in the country. Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame all kind of have that same pedigree. And he made the point that NIL gives those schools a better ability to leverage those assets and go to the big donor like, a Terry Pagula and say, can we have this money for NIL? And it's all in the up and up, and everything's legal, and it's not like it used to be where a car salesman who's supporting Tennessee slips $100,000 in an envelope and meets a kid at a Waffle House. I mean, this is kind of a different world. Are we seeing a pivot here where, you and I have these conversations and say, well, they can't compete with Georgia or Alabama or some of these southern schools for recruits? Do you look at these victories at all in Zane Durant and Dennis-Sutton and say, there's a real opportunity here that Penn State may be getting a leg up on a lot of the sport in NIL, and that there has been a big pivot made and an effort made, and that this is a testament to the work a guy like Michael Mauti. I remember he was kind of at the forefront. I know he's involved in the athletic department now. I've had him on this podcast, and he talked about the importance of this stuff. It just feels like that this is moving in a good direction for Penn State, and that maybe this fear that you're going to lose talent to a ton of other programs it's a shifting culture, and Penn State could be one of the leaders in that.
Yeah, it's kind of interesting for me to see. I mean, obviously, you look at what's happened on the field the last couple of years, where an SEC team hasn't even made the championship game. It's been a lot of Big Ten representation in there specifically, and then obviously Notre Dame this year. It's just interesting because I look at even now the recruiting rankings, I can pull up the class of 2025 recruiting rankings, the guys who are going to be coming in for this next season. And at the top of the board, it's Texas, Georgia, Ohio State, Bama, Oregon, Auburn, Texas A&M, LSU, Michigan, Florida, Tennessee, and then Penn State's down at 15. But to me, that's kind of the same order that we've been seeing every year. And so it's interesting to see that even though the northern schools are potentially spending more, and we don't really have any real data in terms of that, but we can obviously kind of hear the rumors and speculate about kind of how the playing field is evened out. It still appears at least that the SEC is bringing in more talent. You could say maybe the transfer portal plays a role in that, where maybe the Big Ten schools are kind of poaching some of that talent, and that's why. But even when you look at 247 does a team talent composite, which is your entire roster, however many 100 players, what were all of their recruiting rankings, and then it's all plugged into a formula, and all the SEC schools are still at the top in terms of most talented rosters, which is interesting. But because then you look at the actual games and you see what's happening on the field, and it certainly seems like the tide is turning where the Big Ten is starting to play better. So it'll be interesting to see, at least to me, whether this is kind of a one-off, or I guess a two-off, because it's been a couple years now. But if the Big Ten can kind of maintain this, because at least according to the recruiting sites, which people have varying levels of kind of belief into how valid those are, the SEC still appears to be congregating a majority of the talent nationally, and a lot of the top recruits are still coming from those southern states. But again, the on-field product is certainly different. But I'm just curious to see if that'll, remain that way, or if it's just kind of, a case of Michigan and Ohio State peaking.
Well, but I think to your point, Joel, it is also a matter of keeping your own guys, and I don't think the switch is going to flip overnight at the high school level. I'll be interested to see. I've seen some commentary about are we going to see something of a shift away from the high school rankings mattering nearly as much as they did, because you do have these top programs have the ability to basically look at the entire sport every winter and say which guys do we want. And then you talk about high school players and the guys that you're developing, on a separate level. So it's kind of become like, more like free agency. And first you go through signing free agency, and then you do the draft in the, in the summer, like they do in baseball. Is that how this is going to become? Certainly something to keep an eye on. But to your point, they've developed their guys and they've kept their guys. And I think in years past, Penn State has been a place that's been more like, well, if a guy goes to the NFL, that's great. A lot of these marginal cases, Joel, they've left the team behind them thinner. And this year, I think this is the first time you really said, yeah, there's guys going to the pros, but there's lots of guys coming back that otherwise wouldn't have. And I think that's probably the biggest change, more so than, at the high school level. I think there's going to be down. You're probably not going to know for 3, 4, 5, 6 years really where we are, but I think at this point it's reasonable to speculate that there is some level of a tide turning. A couple quick ones here before we go, Joel. How much blame do you put on Drew Allar for the Orange Bowl? Had the catastrophic interception late, missed some receivers, threw a couple picks that got wiped out by penalties. Fortunately for Penn State, I'll just say this. I think it all comes back to the receivers for me, and you can blame Drew for missing, Nick Singleton in the flat over here or Tyler Warren over there, but the entire system of how you play quarterback, you're supposed to be able to go through a progression. There's plays that are designed where the receiver is the guy that's supposed to be open, and when he's not, and you have to speed yourself up and scramble in your mind more so than with your feet, it doesn't look the way people think that it should look. And when you're starting every single play with 3 receivers who aren't open, 1 tight end and 1 running back, you're going to have mistakes, in my opinion. I challenge anyone out there, all these geniuses that were in my Twitter mentions saying, oh, it's all his fault, it was a terrible throw. Yeah, it was an inexcusable interception, but it came at the end of 60 minutes of those guys not being open at all. And I challenge any of you who think you're so smart, put NCAA 25 on Heisman and only throw to your tight end and your running back for 60 minutes and see how you do. I don't think you'll look as smart as you think you are. Joel, what's your read on where Drew Allar belongs on the pecking order of blame for that loss?
Yeah, I think I tend to agree with you there. I don't put too much of the blame on his shoulders. I think the wide receivers can probably take a majority of that blame. I mean, it was a historically bad performance. I forget what year it was, but I saw that it was like 30 years since the last game where Penn State had no receptions by a wide receiver, something crazy. And obviously he had some questionable throws at times, and he was. I mean, I think we could say that he had a bad game, but at the end of the day, I think he's also receiving an unfair share of the blame just for kind of what went down. I look at the interceptions. Some of them weren't great throws, but I do think, and I saw Landon Tengwall kind of point this out on Twitter, that the first 2 that got wiped off the board, Landon at least seems to believe that Allar only threw that ball to get the flag. He threw it to kind of draw the officials' attention to that specific area. And he said that during Penn State practices, when he was a member of the team, that they had Big Ten refs show up to Penn State practices and tell the team or tell the quarterbacks, like, if you throw in the direction of maybe a defensive pass interference or a defensive holding, they're more likely to throw the flag, knowing that it directly impacted the play. Whereas if the quarterback doesn't even look that way, what's the point flagging it if the ball was never coming that way anyway? So I mean, I think that's part of it is Drew kind of recognized that there were penalties on those plays and threw the ball in that direction just to kind of draw attention to it. So I don't really blame him for the penalties that got called back. The one that did not get called back was pretty bad. But you can also look at the route that Omari Evans ran, and it was very rounded, choppy, was not a great cut by him. And the defensive back was running the route for him. Like, the defensive back was in front of Omari Evans, running the route in front of him. And it was just ugly. Drew, after the game, did say that he intended to throw that into the dirt. He didn't even want it to be a catchable ball and just left it too high. And the defensive back, credit to him for making a great play. But obviously you got to just get rid of that one, throw it out of bounds. You can't be trying to, kind of dirt it at his feet, is I think the term Allar used. But I think Allar was bad, but at the same time, given the situation that he was in against a great Notre Dame secondary, which I don't think, Notre Dame secondary got enough credit for what they were able to do with, obviously subpar wide receivers who just could not get open. And you could see it so many times. Every replay that you watch from that game, they're just completely covered downfield and there's nothing there. I think given the circumstances, I don't put a lot of blame on Allar. I think he's still a great quarterback and has the potential to be, a top 3, top 5 quarterback next year.
Well, there's a reason he's here and the other guys aren't. I mean, I think on some level it's just as simple as that. Joel, is the sting of this Orange Bowl loss wholly dependent on how they come back next season and their ability to listen? You made the playoff this year. There was the qualifier of, well, it's a 12-team playoff. It's a little easier to get in, but you would have qualified for a 4-team playoff. You win 2 playoff games to get to what would have been a 4-team playoff. You play 60 whole minutes. You come within 30 seconds of a national championship game if that drive goes differently. Is this a step forward that if you may take the next step like Michigan did a year ago, next year that you look back and say, yeah, that sucked, but it was an important step on the path to finally winning a national championship? Or is this the type of game that regardless of what happens next year or any year in the future, that you're going to look back and have those regrets and wonder what could have been?
Yeah, I tend to think Penn State's really going to rally around this loss, and I think we've talked about this before on another episode that this Penn State team is not necessarily better than the last couple years of Penn State teams. It's just kind of the way that the schedule went, and kind of the expanded playoff giving Penn State a chance to make it in because this Penn State team was very similar to the last couple of years where you kind of came out flat anytime you played really an elite opponent, and I tend to think. If you gave those previous 2 years of Penn State teams the same schedule, they probably end up with the exact same results. Maybe slightly different, but I tend to think Penn State kind of just benefited from the situation it was in this year. But regardless, I think it worked. Penn State made a run to the semifinals, and it seems like they were the way they lost to Notre Dame as well, being so close to a shot at the national championship. I think really stung a lot of people, but I think it inspired change. I think you mentioned the Michigan team and what they were able to do. They had a couple years where they made the semifinals, came pretty close. There was the game against TCU where they lost by whatever it was, I think 1 or 2 points to TCU, came up just short. Next year, they win the national championship game. Ohio State, you're looking at the same thing. You look at what happened with Ohio State last year. I think they went 11-1 in the regular season with the loss to Michigan and missed out on the 14 playoffs. And then this year, obviously another loss to Michigan, but I think this year Ohio State brought back a ton of guys who could have left for the NFL. They got their NIL in order and brought in a ton of big name guys, whether it was Will Howard, whether it was Quinshon Judkins, whether it was Caleb Downs, who have all these guys have been major contributors. They also retained a lot of key pieces. I think you can really compare this Penn State team to those the Michigan team of last year that won the national championship, the Ohio State team of this year that's favored to win a national championship. I think Penn State's in a similar boat where they got really close and people saw, they're a few plays away, they're a few players away. And I think, the players themselves obviously realize that. They realize how close they were. A lot of them have chosen to come back. I think from the NIL perspective, I think a lot of donors have taken notice and then kind of helped Penn State in terms of its retention efforts. I think this is really an opportunity to go all in for Penn State in 2025.
Joel, who do you think, if you're a Penn State fan, you're rooting for in this national championship game? Is it Ohio State because that's a program that you're already decidedly behind on some level, and some measure of Big Ten pride of having the conference win the championship back-to-back years? Do you look at Notre Dame and think, maybe it's a win for parity if they are able to knock off Ohio State and maybe prevent that program from getting in a groove? Do you want to see what happens in Columbus if they lose this game? See the world burn a little bit? What's your read on this national title game from a Penn State perspective?
I think you want to see Ohio State win. I mean, if you're at Penn State, you probably don't you obviously don't want to see either of these teams win, just because, you lost to both of them, and then both were close games, and even, the results of this season, even aside, there's still programs that you have semi-rivalries with. So, obviously you kind of hate to see either team win, just from that aspect. But I think I lean Ohio State. I think Big Ten bragging rights. I think Penn State might also get some kind of share of money if Ohio State wins a national championship and it gets distributed throughout the Big Ten, something like that. If you want to take that angle, but I think just for the Big Ten to be able to say that, it's now won back-to-back national championships with two different teams doing it, I think it says a lot for kind of the state of the conference and then where it is right now.
Yeah, I'm with you, Joel. I don't think it does anyone any good for Notre Dame and their no conference situation to get rolling to any large degree. If you win this game, they win a national championship, the buzz around that program would be, some people would use the word insufferable. I might join them. So I think you're rooting for Ohio State, a program that has established itself well above you. I think you'd rather that be the team that you're trying to knock off than a Notre Dame that kind of gets to be slippery with its schedule and that gets to keep all the money for itself, to the point that you made before. They don't have to share it with anyone in a conference. So excited to see how that all plays out. Joel, thank you for joining me. Folks, we're not sure exactly where we're going from here in terms of a weekly schedule with Penn State. We'll certainly talk to you when there is news, certainly with a defensive coordinator, if there's any huge transfer gets. But with the season being over and most of the big personnel moves having been announced at this point, just consider it a TBD on future podcasts here in the off season. But we appreciate your support all year. Joel, you've been great on these podcasts. We appreciate your time, and everyone else. Subscribe to the channel if you enjoyed this video. Lots of more Steelers offseason content coming your way. We'll be even getting into some spring training soon, before too long, Joel. So thank you all, and we'll talk to you again real soon.
Thank you for checking out this content from Post-Gazette Sports. If you watch this video on YouTube, please like the video and subscribe to our channel. For all of the sports coverage the Post-Gazette has to offer, visit post-gazette.com.